Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. This is such an incredible turnout. My name is Sarah Baker, and I'm the curator here at the Maine Women Writers Collection. On behalf of myself, our director, Jennifer Tuttle, the UNE Libraries, and the Maine Women Writers Collection team, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's very special event. As we gather today on traditional Wabanaki territory, we acknowledge that this land and its waters have been cared for over generations by the Abenaki, Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy peoples. We recognize our responsibility as settlers to listen and to work toward dismantling the ongoing impacts of colonization. We are committed to this work and to amplifying the rich diversity of voices in this place. Before I introduce our speaker, we'd like to thank all of those who made this event possible, including the UNE Office of Communications, UNE Facilities and Housekeeping, and Parkhurst Dining. Now it is my honor to introduce Professor Elizabeth DeWolfe. I think you're going to get a lot of applause tonight. Professor DeWolfe joined Westbrook College in 1996, just days before the merger with the University of New England, and for 30 years has been a dedicated teacher, scholar, and leader at the university. She has taught courses in 19th century American culture, women's history, research methods, and public history, mentoring hundreds of students. She is a prolific historian whose books, including Alias Agnes, Shaking the Faith, The Murder of Mary Bean, all focus on recovering and documenting the lives of women often left out of the historical record. Professor DeWolfe's distinguished career includes numerous honors, awards, and leadership roles. Her books have received recognition from organizations including the New England Historical Association and the Northeast Popular Culture Association. She was named an honorary alumna of Westbrook College and was selected as the inaugural Ludke Chair of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UNE. She has also served as acting director of the Maine Women Writers Collection. Professor DeWolfe will retire this coming May. And it is a joy to celebrate her extraordinary career and her recent well-earned designation as UNE Emerita, a recognition of her many lasting contributions. On behalf of our director, Jennifer Tuttle, and all of us here at the Maine Women Writers Collection, let us offer our heartfelt congratulations and a warm welcome to Professor Beth DeWolfe.
When I started here 30 years ago, I was 5'6". So now I'll tell you a secret. I never dreamed of being a historian. My high school American history class was dull and portrayed history, as wags often suggest, as one damn thing after another. And those things were largely white, male, privileged, and top-down. I had little interest in a future job that seemed to be making lists of dates and memorizing great deeds, especially when those deeds, to a 14-year-old girl in the 1970s, were not things that women did. I found the class a bore and wrote off history as a future career. How ill-behaved of me. It wasn't until I entered graduate school some 20 years later that my youthful memories met a challenge. I entered Boston University's American and New England Studies program in the fall of 1992, coming to the interdisciplinary field from a background in anthropology and art history. And then, in my first year of graduate studies, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich won the Pulitzer Prize for A Midwife's Tale, the story of Hallowell, Maine midwife Martha Ballard. And naturally, we all read it at BU, and my mind was blown. Ulrich saw in a Maine woman's diary what previous researchers had written off as the minutiae of a woman's life, small events like gardening, housework, birthing children, and seeing them as playing no real role in history. As Ulrich herself would later state, well-behaved women seldom make history. What Ulrich put forth was not simply the rich and meaningful story of a remarkable woman, but a methodology that underpins a new history, a history that does not simply add women to a man's tale, but rather centered women as the agents of their own lives. Ulrich's work shaped the questions I asked, first in my dissertation, and then in my subsequent works over my career. History has its share of ill-behaved women. Here are four, each visible because they ended up in court or in front of the legislature or in a coroner's report. In the 19th century, the venues in which men recognized and recorded women. But for the well-behaved, or beyond the ill-behaved 15 minutes of infamy, records are sparse. And the more ordinary or well-behaved a woman, the more invisible she becomes. And there's the challenge. So tonight I'd like to share just bits and pieces of my three major research projects and the four women at their centers. Each has an aspect deemed ill-behaved. It is, after all, our entrance point to recover their lives. For example, Mary Dyer, a mob-leading, speech-giving, screaming-in-the-road activist fighting the Shakers. And Beringira Caswell, a young woman having sex outside of marriage and then attempting to remove the resulting pregnancy. And Madeline Pollard, a mistress, and Jane Tucker, the fake friend who tried to throw her under the bus during a nationally watched trial. Our starting point is the conventional historical narrative that paints women like these as ill, irrational, or morally questionable. Their lives summed up as a moral lesson, a cautionary tale, or a colorful anecdote. 15 minutes of infamy. But let's start with a different assumption, that their experiences reveal the multiple ways that women's lives mattered as full human beings. We'll start with the subject of my dissertation and first book, Mary Marshall Dyer. Mary Dyer was born in New Hampshire in 1780. She married Joseph Dyer, a recent widower with a son, and they raised 5 children together in a northern New Hampshire farm. But Mary was religiously motivated, and she sought opportunities to preach, a rarity at the very beginning of the 19th century. There were few options except for one, a new sectarian faith, a communal group who happened to be in New Hampshire, the Shakers. So with her family and several neighbors, they all joined the Shakers. And at first, Mary found a home. She found a relief from the hardscrabble life of the New Hampshire frontier. And the Shakers believed in gender equality. Yet, they were a very hierarchical society. And while women indeed were religious leaders and eldresses of the community, you had to work your way up to that role. And that was a challenge for Mary. Eventually, the Shaker elders and Mary butted heads one too many times, and Mary decided to leave. She announced to the elders and to her husband Joseph that she was going, and she was taking the children. The elders and Joseph said no, and Mary was forced to flee the village. And so Mary is now married, but without her husband. She's a mother without her children. When Mary left, she still expected that husband to provide for her, room and board in some location, not with the Shakers. She demanded Joseph's support. So he responded with the legal and cultural practice available to him: runaway wife ads. And so the deal was that when you married, a wife would perform the normal domestic duties and respect her husband's good name. She would act in a proper way to protect her husband's name. The husband, in turn, would provide the tools for her work and a safe place to live, room and board. In a runaway wife ad, the husband, in this case Joseph, announces that Mary, my lawful wife, has absented herself from my place of residence, and therefore the deal was off. Anyone in town who supported Mary could not then turn to the husband and say, hey, your wife's been boarding with me for 5 weeks, pay up. So this is his announcement that Mary has broken the marriage contract. What's interesting is Mary continues to make demands of Joseph, including standing in the street outside of the Shaker village and yelling, "This you call the worship of God?" A few weeks later, Joseph publishes a second ad. This time he writes, "Whereas Mary, who is considered to be my wife." Their relationship was going downhill. But Mary realized something terrifying. Without her husband, she was now legally and socially invisible. She cannot contract a debt. She cannot sue. She cannot sell property, even if she brought it into their marriage, or property that was ostensibly hers. But what Mary could do is she could get allies, like James Willis, an Enfield, New Hampshire shopkeeper who was not all that fond of the Shaker community down the road. This is a copy of the ledger page. He ran a general store, and a wife would go there and get the supplies she needed. The account would be in the husband's name. Mary bought things on Joseph's account, even though they were estranged. Willis sues Joseph Dyer. So we can approach this document in two ways. We can approach the document as Joseph would, as a legal document, as evidence that Mary had broken their marriage contract, and thus this bill is null and void. But we can also approach it as Mary would, a cultural document that records her strategy for fighting back against her husband and eventually the Shakers. We see this in material culture, in fabric and paper. So if we notice up on the top here, Mary purchases lots and lots of fabric, 5.5 yards of calico, 7 more yards of calico, right before she went to Concord. Why is she going to Concord, and why all the fabric? Because Mary has put a petition in front of the New Hampshire legislature to intervene in this dilemma. And in order to present herself as a respectable woman, she wants to make a new dress. The second item she buys is more telling. A half quire of paper. And what is she going to do with paper? She writes and writes and writes. The frontispiece of her book shows her with a quill pen in hand. It's a way for her to say, I wrote this. Mary Dyer wrote 5 books from 1817 to the 1850s. Now, earlier generations of scholars, and this is what intrigued me as I searched for a dissertation topic, earlier generations of scholars saw Dyer as insane. Why would you carry on a fight against the Shakers for 50 years? She led mobs. She appeared before the legislature twice. She traveled around New England getting statements from other former Shakers. Who does this? The translation? An ill-behaved woman raising a ruckus. She must be unstable or over-emotional. And some scholars even pointed to these 5 books as evidence that she couldn't just let it go. She must be nuts. And so I read her books. She wasn't nuts. She was angry, and she wanted her children. Joseph had all the power. It was up to him to decide what to do with the children, as he said, by the laws of man and by the laws of the Creator. But Mary was clever. She knew that women can give emotional support, but men pass laws. Her most important work, A Portraiture of Shakerism, is in 2 parts. The first part focuses on laws and religious history, documenting for her readers how Shakerism was out of sync with mainstream Christianity. That part of the book is geared towards men who can pass laws. Part 2 is filled with emotion, Mary writing how her tears spilling from her eyes blur the ink on the page. Women can't change laws, but they can build a network. They offer emotional support, and they offer access to men who can make changes. When previous scholars looked at Mary Dyer, they looked at her books as isolated objects, divorced from their author and from the publishers. But internal clues in her text suggest that Dyer played a very active role in disseminating her work, that she traveled from town to lecture and sell books. Some found her extraordinary, others found her horrid. Dyer's active engagement with her own work included hand-correcting typographic errors. When I encountered one such amended volume, this spurred me to seek out every extant copy and look for the same corrections. I even begged my grad school friends doing research in distant libraries to look up A Portraiture of Shakerism for me. In addition, reading volume after volume of the same book showed me how readers interacted with the text. Which books had owners' signatures and from where? What was underlined or starred? What comments were written in the margins? And then, in one book I looked at, an incredible surprise, a handbill for a Christmas Day lecture to the ladies, a document totally unknown, pasted in the very back of the book. It suggests that someone attended her talk, bought her book, and slipped the flyer into the back. Is this the sign of a crazy lady or a woman with a mission, as she said, to gain the just rights of women? And then there was the day I found her handwritten will. And here's an interesting thing. Mary's will was copied into the official county records, but with a subtle difference. A clerk's correction that changed the meaning. But when I saw her original, I noticed the difference. Right here, she writes, "I will and bequeath unto my eldest son Caleb $1 in money." And she also gave her second son, Orville, $1 in money. "These 2 are my beloved children, and they are now living with the Shakers at the said Enfield in New Hampshire. It's my will and wish not to give these children while with Shakers only property enough to clear the law. To their brother Jereb, who had left the Shakers, he inherited everything else." Mary Dyer is writing, "and wish not to give those children while Shakers only prop," and she stops and backs up. "Not while her children are Shakers, while her children are with the Shakers, almost 50 years after they had joined the faith. Her punctuation tells us Mary Dyer was first and foremost a mother, and still insisting her children were simply located with the Shakers, not Shakers themselves. Mary Dyer died alone in her house in 1867 from a stroke. Her will left the majority of her property and assets to her son Jared, who had left the Shakers in the 1850s. He dutifully settled her estate and erected a gravestone. The inscription reads, Mary M., wife of Joseph Dyer. Yet Mary had not been his wife for 30 years. Among her accomplishments, she changed New Hampshire divorce law in the 1830s to relieve women in her very situation with a spouse in a sect that deems the marriage bond is void. The law is still on the books. In April of 1850, a rat-chewed body tied to a barn board was pulled from a culvert near Storer Street in Saco. A crowd gathered. The constable called for a local physician. The doctor examined the body. It was a woman. She had died from sepsis following an abortion. James Smith, a Storer Street physician, was arrested. He was known to provide that service. His barn was missing a board. The board pulled from the river was a perfect match. Within a few days, the body had a name, Mary Bean, a young woman who had lived with Dr. James Smith in late November and December. Neighbors remembered her because of her long dark hair and high forehead. She also wore a racy accessory, drop earrings. But who was Mary Bean? I first learned of Mary Bean's demise from a work of sensational fiction, a novella written in 1850. It turned out to be one of two about this case. In the first, Mary Bean, or the Mysterious Murder, the beautiful Mary Bean catches the eye of George Hamilton, a man from her village who's been out in the world for several years. He was making his fortune, or was he? For reasons that are unclear, perhaps he's just a jerk, he determines to ruin Mary Bean. He entices her to run away from her fiancé, her sister, and her home, and go with him to Manchester, New Hampshire. He swears he'll marry her after completing some business deals. She works in the factory to pass the time. He convinces her to engage in physical relations. And then he vanishes. Mary tracks him down, reveals she is pregnant, and he takes her to a Dr. Savin, and she was never seen again. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you. In the second novella, Confessions of George Hamilton, Mary's body is found, and Hamilton pins the murder on his brother. Counterfeiters, another murder, the mean streets of Saco. These were clearly fiction, but I wondered, was there any fact behind it? So it didn't take long, looking through Saco newspapers, to find full-page, big headline reports on the murder of Mary Bean, the young woman pulled from the brook. While this extra, a single sheet of paper published in between the weekly issues of the newspaper, as in extra, extra, read all about it, this extra still refers to the victim as Mary Bean. But within a few days, Bean was revealed to be a name that Smith gave his patient. Her real name was Beringira Caswell, an American from a farming family that lived just over the border in Canada. Beringira, with her sisters, had worked in the factories in Lowell and then Manchester. And it was in New Hampshire that she met William Long, a young man from Biddeford. In the summer of 1849, they engaged in criminal relations. By November, she came to Saco looking for him. She was pregnant. Smith was arrested, tried by the grand jury, and held over for trial. He had barely gotten settled in the jail in Alfred when the first of the two novellas was published. It's part opportunistic to cash in on a salacious event, but it also reflects a bigger cultural moment. Young women leaving homes in the watchful eyes of their parents. These cautionary tales tell mill girls and their parents how to avoid Mary Bean's fate. In fact, much to my surprise, during this research, I found about 8 tales of factory girls set in Saco or Biddeford in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Girls who are ill-behaved get mentioned in novellas. They buy dresses. How wasteful. They preen in front of mirrors. How vain. They dare to pair up with a man without dad's approval. Hussies. And they all end up dead, insane, or pregnant, and then dead. Now, in one exception of the stories I found, the well-behaved girl doesn't die, but her grandmother does, in a terrible fire. Lucky for the mill girl, the man who rescues her is the son of the mill owner, and now she no longer has to work and can remain safe at home. And when the mill population shifts from New England's daughter, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant girls, to immigrants, these cautionary tales fade away. But not entirely. While the populace no longer cares about the fate of the immigrant girls working in the mills, these novellas follow our Protestant girls into other venues, such as cautionary tales set in boarding schools, shops, or stores. And the moral is always the same: to be safe, girls stay home. So sensational fiction, for generations of scholars dismissed as trash reading with little literary value, actually has tremendous archival value, documenting the challenges to young women in the workforce, and not the creepy guy hiding in the alley, but rather the challenge of a middle-class society unwilling to release daughters from surveillance. And this all started with a body in the brook. Now, here's why I really love history. The fiction used conventions well understood in the 1850s that, when looked at in the 21st century, somewhat mystifies us. But those conventions added meaning. For example, in the fiction, Dr. James Smith becomes Dr. Savin. And for a while it puzzled me, why would you change the name Smith to Savin? And then I learned that Savin is a centuries-old and well-known abortifacient. So putting that on the cover is a signal to readers that what you're about to read is a little racy. It's the same as if today you read a book that featured Dr. Cyanide. Now, the interesting thing here is that in addition to a cultural clue of how these were being read, this also nods to the method that Dr. Smith likely used in his attempt to produce a medicinal abortion. And then there's this. So I looked at this cover, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times. And after the book was published, I moved on to other projects, including a project in Victorian hair jewelry. And when I went back to the Mary Bean book, preparing for a talk, what leapt out at me is a cultural clue that I had missed, but that 19th century readers would have known right away. Mary Bean, our fictional version of Beringira, is wearing a hair bracelet, and there it is. It's that style. And this is a catalog page advertising hair bracelets. A Victorian hair jewelry was not just about mourning. Female friends, mothers to daughters, mothers to sons, brother to sister, all shared this craft, which for the middle class showed sentimentality and sincerity. And what our artist is trying to hint at in this cover is that Mary Bean was an innocent, naive, sincere girl who fell in with a jerk. The material culture and the dailiness of women's lives, what Ulrich elsewhere called the humdrum, is revealed between the cracks of a literature that some made the mistake to discard. But Beringira Caswell was a very real person who died a very real, painful, and lonely death. If not for her interaction in a court of law as a dead victim, we would likely know nothing of her. The only written evidence of her life in her own hand is a signature in a payroll journal from the Amoskeag Mill. Yet still, her short life and sad death uncovered a story of mill workers, of young women for the first time earning cash wages and learning what the power of labor meant. Her story revealed the availability of legal, 1849, legal abortion, and the various methods from the safe to the very dangerous. It revealed tensions between Saco mill owners and the workers within, and how the death of one young woman was a bellwether for a shifting workforce and a pushback against New England's daughters working. And yet, Beringira's story was forgotten. By 1900, a Saco historian writing a house-by-house history of days gone by recorded the location of James Smith's house, painting him in unjust and nefarious tones. The historian misnamed William Long and recast the timeline and circumstances of the discovery of Caswell's body from several months to just a couple of days. He never even mentioned Beringira's name. The fictional ending placed a monument to Mary outside her married sister's home, a constant reminder of exactly where that sister should stay. By a lucky coincidence, I was in touch with a family descendant, and she told me what the family thought had happened to great-great-aunt Beringira. What she posited was that in their Canadian home on the St. John River, there was a holiday party, and the girls were skating. Beringira fell through the ice, and her body floated all the way from Canada to Saco. Now, my contact knew that that did not make any sense, but they had no idea what had happened to her. The family photo that the family shared may or may not be Beringira. It's unlabeled. No living relative has an idea of who she is. One newspaper article published after the trial contained a short statement from Beringira's sister, Thais. She described Beringira's favorite purse. It was shaped like a bean, and in it she kept her little collection of shiny 5-cent pieces, which Thais said Beringira collected as a fancy. Once COVID restrictions were lifted and I could travel to Canada, I visited her grave. I left the shiniest nickel I could find. My most recent project, and the biggest challenge of them all, here we have Madeline Pollard, the most famous or infamous woman of 1894, and Jane Tucker, who hid behind the scenes. My project began as a biography of Madeline Pollard, the mistress of a U.S. congressman. I wanted to find out more. I wanted to find the before and the after the trial that made her a household name, a metaphor for the weaknesses of men, and the punchline of many jokes. Who was she? No one had bothered to ask. As for Jane Tucker, when I began this project, I hadn't a clue she existed. No one did. So how do you recover someone you don't even know? This is an example of how, as a historian, I don't pick my projects. Sometimes history thrusts the projects at you. So we'll start with Madeline. Madeline was born in Kentucky, and she lived in Crab Orchard. When she was a young girl, her father died unexpectedly, and it shattered the family. Some of her siblings were sent to a Masonic orphan home. Her youngest brother stayed with her mother, who moved in with a similarly widowed sister. The oldest children were set out on their own, and Madeline was shunted from aunt to aunt to aunt. What she wanted more than anything was an education, a literary life. She was an early reader, quite precocious, said to be her father's favorite, and together they learned poetry, Greek, and Shakespeare. But how could she afford college? An older bachelor farmer, somewhat distant family friend, named James Rhodes, became smitten with young Madeline as she approached 17. And he offered to pay her tuition if, when she finished school, she would marry him. Or, Madeline threw in, I'll pay you back. And so she goes to college. But not there. She goes to college, but he runs out of money at the end of her first year, and she panics. And so she writes a letter, and keep in mind, she has no father. She has no older brothers with whom she's lived, let alone seen, in almost a decade. And so she writes to an up-and-coming politician, a Lexington, Kentucky lawyer that she happened to have encountered on a train. Breckinridge was running for Congress and shook hands with everyone as he moved along the carriage. She wrote Breckinridge. He came to the college. He suggested they take a carriage ride to discuss this situation. Yada, yada, yada. 3 days later, she is his mistress. There we go. Now, let's skip ahead 9 years and 3 pregnancies. She waits for Breckinridge to make good on his promise. She's actually living a double life in Washington, D.C. She is a favorite of D.C. society. She goes to all the best parties. She knows all the best people. She even pals around with literary luminaries like Charles Dudley Warner, William Dean Howells, the artist Frederick Remington. She knew them all, but secretly, she's still a mistress. And when Breckinridge's wife dies in 1892, and the year of mourning has elapsed, Madeline thinks her path is finally clear and Breckinridge will marry her, but he drags his feet on an engagement announcement. So Madeline writes one herself and publishes it in the Washington Post. But surprise, Breckinridge already has a new wife. He's married someone else. He thinks his problem is solved. Madeline will simply slink away. But no, she sues him for breach of promise. This was my starting point with this project. What was the road that led her to this point, to the event that would fossilize Pollard as a congressman's mistress and nothing more? In women's history, often you have to start with the men. Breckinridge's family papers are at the Library of Congress. I read copious letters to his constituents and legal team, and they were all looking for Pollard's alleged other lovers. reports of her at brothels, picking up men at bars, hotels, on trains, resorts, none of which actually ever panned out to be true. But this was their focus, her sexual history. A very slim file dedicated to trial preparation had little personal info on Pollard. Most interesting to me was a list of aliases, which Breckinridge's team took to suggest she had perpetuated numerous schemes of false identity. But that's not it. In a he said, she said debate, what we need are primary documents that predate the trial, that predate Pollard's relationship with Breckinridge. So let's return to Cincinnati Wesleyan. She loved her classes. She loved her classmates, all these like-minded women who were intellectually curious. She loved the library. And a critical piece of information, this article from the Cincinnati Enquirer of March of 1884, where Madeline participated in a debate in front of 500 people in the city, and she won. Two important points here. One, this predates her first encounter with Breckinridge. And second, this marks her literary aspirations, where in court, 10 years after this debate, lawyers would suggest that her literary desires were merely an affectation, a way to lure in the rich. But this tells us her literary dreams were long-standing. And we also know that while at Cincinnati Wesleyan and elsewhere, she played with her name. When her father was alive, she met many politicians. He was a politician as well. And she no doubt talked about her encounter to her schoolmates, who in turn teased her. They called her Madeline Joe Blackburn, Bill Breckinridge Pollard. And Madeline didn't care for her middle name, Valeria. She adopted Vivian, a name she read in a book. And likely, it was a book that was published in 1884 about a young woman with a broken family desperate for an education. It's a wonderful example of how Madeline's reading shaped her sense of self. And who here has not played with their name? In the summer before I went to college, I had an internship in California, Nerdy Science Fair Prize. See, I still wasn't thinking history. Wanted to be an astronaut. Yes, I was about 10 inches short of the minimum height. But in California, I couldn't be Beth. So I told anyone who asked, my name was Liz. It didn't stick. But her debate, Madeline's studies, her reading documents, her literary dreams, not as Breckinridge's lawyers would mock in the courtroom. It's a long-standing part of her being. And going back further, we can take another look at Crab Orchard. To outside or modern eyes, it sounds like a tiny rural Kentucky town, probably backwards. But in fact, Crab Orchard was like Poland Spring. Cooling air, refreshing waters, and a literary and cultured summer life with ladies in elegant white dresses, music, readings, and art. Madeline Pollard witnessed this growing up. Now let's rethink her life path. Her father dies. Her family split up, not even older brother to protect her. She writes to Breckinridge. She's vulnerable. I reread her account of the carriage ride. Madeline wrote how when she returned to the school and left the carriage, Breckinridge pressed money into her hand. She tried to resist it. Breckinridge later admitted that during the ride, he took liberties. As she leaves the carriage, Madeline walks past her schoolmates and teachers who were out taking the evening air. And, quote, she said not a word to anyone. Why? Because as much as she knew Latin and Shakespeare, she had no words for the liberties that were taken by a sexual predator. But in 9 years' time, those words would come, and the entire country heard them. Now let's go back to the Breckinridge Papers. I read these papers chronologically, from the eruption of the scandal to the trial. And in January of 1894, about 6 weeks out before the start of the trial, it is very clear that the Breckinridge team is floundering. They really don't have a good plan in place for a defense. And then I started seeing some odd comments and references to a Miss P, a Miss Johnson, and some sort of shrewd letter, and a lawyer writing how I am satisfied she will find some way to get at the desired party. What was going on? There was some scheme afoot. And this started me on some of the most complicated, convoluted recovering I have ever done, because I wanted to know who was Miss Parker. And it took about 6 weeks, but I figured it out. Miss Agnes Parker is Jane Armstrong Tucker of Wiscasset, Maine. And if any of you have been to the historic house, Castle Tucker, that is her home. But she was so hidden in history that even historic New England, that maintains that historic property, had no idea of the story that I told them of my research. Jane was independent. She wanted to live independent of husband and father. She learned stenography and typing, modern skills for the modern young woman. She worked in Boston and New York City. And in New York, she met a Kentucky businessman, Charles Stoll, the best boss, she said, she ever had. But 1893 was a terrible, terrible economic year. And in the downturn, the Kentucky man and his compatriots closed their New York office, and Jane lost her job. By January of 1894, she is back in Maine, nursing with her mother, nursing her various ailments and feeling like a failure. And suddenly letters and telegrams begin to appear, written by Charles Stoll, begging her to take a job. Oh, he can't give any details, but she can name her salary. He asks Jane, meet me in Boston, and she does. And here's the job. Undercover detective. Be a spy for a U.S. congressman. I know, it's unbelievable, right? A congressman acting ill-behaved. Who could figure? And so off Jane goes, suddenly feeling very healthy, off to Washington. And when she steps off that railway car in D.C., she is now Agnes Parker. And so she goes here to the House of Mercy, an Episcopal home for fallen women. And while most of the inmates cried to get out, Jane cried and lied to get in, posing as a woman who had been cruelly jilted by a deceptive man. And in she goes to the House of Mercy, where she befriends Madeline Pollard. A side note, we also know what Jane read as she grew up. In her childhood diaries, she wrote down everything that she read. And while Madeline favored the classics, Jane read popular bestsellers, including Little Women, and she was very much a Jo March. And interestingly, in her youth, she read detective fiction. So for 10 weeks, Jane spies on Madeline. Madeline sees Jane as her new best friend because with the revelation of the scandal, all of her society friends had dropped her. She was estranged from her family. Her mother disowned her. Madeline is as lonely as can be. In fact, she is so enamored with Jane that in her head she makes post-trial plans. They'll live together in New York, a bohemian life. They go shopping together, take carriage rides and walks. Jane accidentally runs into Madeline at church, on the street, at a store, in a trolley. And every night during the trial, Jane brings her a snack and they talk. And Jane wrote, "As she ate my salad, she opened her heart to me." And then Jane went back to her boarding house and typed up Madeline's secrets and sent them to Breckenridge. When the trial ended, Madeline never saw Jane again. And she probably didn't want to. Jane wrote this book, a tell-all of the life with Madeline Pollard, a behind-the-scenes look that was trying to sway any public sympathy away from Madeline. Over the years, this book has been variously cataloged as a memoir or fiction. In fact, there is only one extant copy that survives, and that is at the Lexington Public Library. I actually read it early on in my project and then set it aside. It seemed outrageous until I saw those references to Miss P in Breckenridge's letters and remembered this book by Agnes Parker. And so rereading the real Madeline Pollard next to Breckenridge's correspondence showed interconnections. Renting a typewriter, Harper's Weekly as a literary lure to get Madeline to talk, providing Kentucky bourbon for Madeline's throat, so sore from all the testifying in court. And with Jane Tucker's letters home, even though she did not reveal to her family what she was actually doing in Washington, the statements she makes dovetail with the real Madeline Pollard and her notes to Breckenridge's legal team. And this told me, this is real. The real Madeline Pollard came out just after the trial. The publisher hurried it into print because he wanted to make a profit while the scandal was still a hot topic. The book bombed. Her mission was described as an unfortunate one, a pitiful business, and a humiliating occupation for a woman of intelligence or with a lively sense of honor. The book was strange and nauseating from a moral, social, and literary standpoint. Even a family friend struggled to find something kind to say. Too much sameness and repetition, the trouble with all detective stories. And there were many, many more. Now keep in mind, I am writing a book and reading these critics' reviews at the same time. Nothing there to make you nervous. And when Jane returns to Maine and shares her incredible tale with her family, they are aghast. They bury it. There is no copy of the real Madeline Pollard at Castle Tucker or in the historic New England archive. Jane continued to live and work independently. She was a traveling salesperson for a corset company, for a supplier of Japanese decorative items, and then later she traveled out west as a salesperson for Butterick Patterns, and at one point thought that she would settle in Montana. But her mother grew ill, and Jane returned to Maine and to the home and to what Jane Addams called the family claim. And upon the death of her mother in the 1920s, Jane stayed at Castle Tucker for the rest of her life. She died in 1964. Her obituary read, "Sea Captain's daughter dies." Her father, the sea captain, had been dead for 69 years. And Madeline As the trial concluded, Madeline Pollard was offered all kinds of opportunities. Star in a play, any play you want. We'll write a play for you. Sing in an opera. Oh, we don't care if you can sing or not. Give a series of lectures. Give one lecture. Write a book. Madeline turned them all down. She won that breach of promise suit. Breckinridge never paid her the court award. And a note, he didn't pay Jane either. Now, likely with the assistance of a New York philanthropist, Madeline went to London, and by 1897 is an American expat. She lives here in this flat. It's in the Chelsea district. It is 1 block from the Thames. There are gardens, there's an embankment, and from her top floor flat, you could watch the regatta races on the river. She lived here with a young Irish widow, a woman named Vi Hassard. And it appears that her benefactor was Margaret Jader, who was the wife and also herself a philanthropist from New York City. We see the interconnectedness of these and other women when we look at different records. The court, the trial, was all about legal documents, but her post-life is about a world of women. And so some of the things that we find include the phone book. How do you document where someone lives in a city and how long they rent an apartment? Look them up in a phone book. And so I did. And I found records for Vi Hassard, 12 Lawrence mansions in that top floor flat from the early 1930s, when they evidently first got their telephone, to September of 1940. What happens in London in September of 1940? The Blitz. Their phone is disconnected by November, and they are no longer living in Lawrence mansions. Passport applications tell us she traveled across Europe and even into Egypt. She didn't hide. She continued to play with her name, but she never masked her identity. One of my inspired, let's call it inspired, finds comes from insomnia plus Google. And what I Googled was not Madeline's name, but her address. And up popped this. Columbia University catalog from 1919-1920. Pollard M. Urquhart, 12 Lawrence Mansions, London. It's Madeline. And here's the U.S. Census for 1920, living with Margaret Jader, Urquhart, Pollard. Why she picked up that name and reinvention continues to puzzle me. But there she is. And here is her coming over to the United States. Her occupation, a student. She traveled on the SS Paris, first class. Madeline finally lived her lifelong dream. She was at college, and she was studying literature and creative writing. And there's her picture from about 1930. Madeline was so much more than a mistress. And while the women of Kentucky made sure Breckinridge never held political office again, Madeline lived the life of which she had always dreamed. Jane is buried in her family plot in Wiscasset. Her home passed to her niece, who passed it to historic New England. Jane's spy days are now part of the tour. My project began with a quest to see the real Madeline Pollard, to see her beyond a name in an online list of congressional mistresses involved in sex scandals. I wanted to know what name would be on her grave. What would she take into eternity? And so we traveled to Devon, and a map of the cemetery was posted on an office supply door in the little town hall. Madeline was buried 14 rows up and 4 to the right. Madeline is buried in an unmarked grave. I have been privileged to spend a career recovering women, ill or well-behaved, victims or vixens. When we center women's narratives and foreground their stories and their points of view, when we invest them with independent agency, when we take seriously the totality of their lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we enrich our history and create a historical record that is more accurate and inclusive and demonstrates that women's lives matter. A record that suggests to girls in American history class that they too are part of history, and that historian might be a cool profession after all. It is the infamous moment that brings some women into history, but when we move to the before and after, when we release these women from being frozen in time, those 15 minutes of infamy standing for the totality of their lives. Mary Dyer was more than an agitator. Pollard was more than a mistress. Tucker was more than a spy. And Beringira Caswell was far more than a dead body in a Saco brook. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that wonderful talk. We do have some time for questions. Because we're recording this evening, we'll be passing around a microphone. If you wouldn't mind, please speaking into that. Does anyone have the first question?
How old was your last character there when she finally went to college? How old was she?
Oh, she was in her 60s. She was in her 60s.
So on the Columbia page, the person right on top of Madeline had the same last name. Is there some connection, like the Urquhart or whatever?
No, I don't think so. Great question. I think it's a coincidence. You see Madeline using Urquhart in her name as early as the 1910 UK census. It shows up as a middle name. I know there's an Irish castle of that name. There was some knight in days of yore of that name. But why she adopted it and built it in at that time, I really don't know. I'd love to know. Yeah.
What was the date that you were able to tell the people at Castle Tucker this information so that they could incorporate it into their tours?
Was probably about 8 or 9 years ago at this point. I'm trying to remember when I discovered Tucker. 9, I'm doing math in my head. Yeah, I think it was about 9, maybe even 10 years ago. This was a long project. So once I uncovered that Agnes Parker was actually Jane Tucker, and then much to my astonishment to learn that she was from Maine, and then that there was an archive of her family papers. I emailed the curator at Historic New England in Boston and told them I'd like to see the Tucker family papers. They invited me down, and I went into the reading room, and I sat at a long table. There was the archivist and the curator and a librarian and a director, and I walked them through my research and the sources I used, including census records and city directories and vital records, a catalog from the Hickok School of Typing and Stenography. I walked them through this whole thing, and they sat there and said, no, I'm sorry, you have the wrong Jane Tucker. It's a very common name. And I was sitting there thinking, where did I go wrong? I was so sure. And then I think it was the archivist asked, where did you say she did this spying? I said, Washington. And I literally saw her eyes go, and she said, wait, I cataloged that collection. I'm sure there are letters from Washington. And she ran up and brought down the file box, and there we had it. The letters start in January of 1894, when Stoll first contacts Jane, and they end in May of 1894, when the trial is over and Jane publishes her book. And because of all the reading I had done, 830 boxes of Breckinridge family papers, and most of the stuff will never see the light of day in a publication, but what it does is it builds a mental map. So the instant I saw those dates, I knew I was right, and they did too. And they were delighted, because it's one thing to have a historic house and say, notice the freestanding flying staircase. It's another thing to say, notice the staircase that a spy used. And as far as I know, Jane Tucker is the first undercover female detective in Maine. So take that, Jessica Fletcher.
There's a Breckinridge estate on the York River in southern Maine, and I wondered if you happen to know of any relationship to the.
I don't think so. The Breckinridges are a very big extended Kentucky family. It's very possible. The Breckinridge family originated in Baltimore years and years and years ago, 18th century. So it's possible there's an offshoot there. There were lots and lots of Breckinridges. And in the Breckinridge family papers, you see this interesting dynamic. So Breckinridge dies in 1904. His daughter, Sophonisba, who was the same age as Madeline Pollard, donates all of her father's papers to the Library of Congress, and subsequently other family members that donate papers as well of other Breckinridges. In the 19th century, the famous Breckinridges were the men. They were politicians, a vice president, the Civil War, on both sides, interestingly, for the Breckinridges. But in the 20th century, it's the women. Sophonisba was the first woman at the University of Chicago to earn a Ph.D. in economics and political science. She was the first dean of women. She did incredible things for the settlement house movement. And there are many other. Frontier Nursing Service is a Breckinridge woman as well, Mary DeShay. And so you have this interesting shift, which is a rabbit hole that I did not go down at the time.
I think that Frontier Nursing Service, Breckinridge, is tied to this estate in southern Maine, but we can talk about it later.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm hiding in the corner. Hey, Beth. There's so many things that I admire about you and your career. And this is one of many beautiful swan songs I think that we'll see as you move towards your retirement. But one of the things I've always been curious about is you're so wedded in a good way. I mean, also to your husband, but also to these He's a delight too. But to these book projects, and specifically doing deeply archivally researched, but meticulous. Your research is meticulous. And I wonder if this is your way of ensuring the record is actually corrected, right? Sure, you published articles and you do as many talks as I do, and all of these things are really important. But you've always had these book projects that ensure that the stories of these women are not just recovered temporarily or fleetingly, but in the record. And I'd love to know a little bit more about how that's been important in your career.
Thank you. That's a great question. Once I learn a woman's story and start to peel apart the layers and and recover their lives, I almost viscerally feel that it's my duty to tell their tale, that they have been ignored or discarded or simply unrealized for so much of time that it's up to me to bring them back. And so, yeah, the book, I like the book format because you have that expanse of pages to really dig in. I would say, and I'm very proud of this, I am a tenacious researcher. I know Madeline Pollard's phone number. And my husband can attest to this, we hovered outside that apartment hoping someone would open the door so we could peek inside. When we went to Devon, I wanted to see the last place that Madeline lived. So indeed, it was the Blitz that chased Madeline and Vi out of London. They'd lived in that apartment since about 1917. And they moved to Linton and Lynmouth in the far western coast of Devon, where they live with Vi's sister-in-law in a wonderful house called Cliff House, way up on a cliff. And I wanted to see it. And we stayed in a little B&B right down the cliff from it, walked up there. Oh man, what a workout on the butt. And was disappointed to find it was gated. So I tore a piece of paper out of a notebook. I wrote my name, said what I was doing, shoved my business card in it, and tucked it in the gate. And the next day I got an email. Sure, come on by. So I really feel that I can't turn my back on these stories. And it is what I plan to do in my retirement, is tell even more of them. And I'm sure the psychologists in the room can say there's something in there too about not wanting to be forgotten. So if I can tag along into eternity with these women, then that would make me very proud and happy.
I'm maybe still trying to formulate it, but I was thinking a little bit about the way you said that the stories choose you in some way, or the women choose you in some way, and then also you said that was a hole I didn't go down, or something I didn't chase. And I was wondering if there were any moments where you felt called but couldn't pursue, and if so, do you plan to pursue any of those?
Yes. Yes, there are, you run into dead ends. And with the Pollard Tucker project, one of the fascinating things is they are not the only stories in this book. Almost everyone who testified for the plaintiff, for Madeline, was female, from the very, very elite Julia Churchill Blackburn, as in Churchill Downs, it's her family, to the formerly enslaved Sarah Gist. So you have, picture this, you have an African-American formerly enslaved woman in a courtroom that is all white men, because women were banned from the courtroom. This was way too unseemly. And so her story, I've traced her back to 1850 in Lexington. I know she was auctioned in a hotel in Tuscumbia, Alabama in 1841. but there's a 9-year gap that I can't yet figure out, but I'm certainly going to try. I will also, I'm probably contractually required to admit that the vast majority of projects that find me by way of my husband's rare and antiquarian bookstore, DeWolfe and Wood, because one of their specialties is Americana, and it's the unusual thing that sticks out, that catches both of our eyes. Yes, I married him for his ephemera, and that's not true. It's a lucky happenstance. And these are the kinds of things that engage us both as historians and as preservers of the past in different ways, building library collections, including this one, and writing about them.
Thank you, Beth, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Without any spoilers, what's next?
Gilded Age, Petty Crime, Chicago.
Thank you.
Dun, dun, dun.
Do we have any other questions this evening? Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you. Thank you.